Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn shares the account of how in Moscow back in 1937, a rousing speech had been given in praise of Joseph Stalin. And when it was finished, the audience stood to its feet and began clapping. The applause went on and on until finally, after 11 minutes, the director of a paper factory sat down, and at long last, everybody else could sit. That same night, the paper factory director was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. And he was told during his interrogation, "Don't ever be the first person to stop clapping." You could make the case that the same thing is happening in our day. Today we are expected to clap. Today we are expected to fall in line with the insanity that grips our culture. Case in point, I don't know if you saw this article from this past week. CVS goes woke and launches gender transition guide. And so according to CVS's new gender transition guidelines, the store will actually require its workers to address people by their preferred pronouns and names. Employees can also use whichever restroom or locker room they desire, regardless of whether they have identified as a transgender. And transitioning employees are encouraged to inform their employers of their life-alternating decision so that the staff can provide support to make your transition as smooth as possible. Can you see it there? It's not enough to tolerate transgender ideology. If you don't celebrate it, if you don't clap, well, then you can lose your job. Here's the point, gang. There comes a point where we as believers have to say, sorry, we will not clap. Did you bring a Bible with you today? Let's drop anchor in Daniel chapter 3, shall we, this morning? A little easier section than we tackled last week. More of a narrative, more story, a familiar story, but again, as I mentioned earlier, an incredibly relevant and timely story. Daniel chapter 3, our series, of course, is Against the Flow, right? Subtitled, We're Residents of Jerusalem, but we're living in Babylon. Our citizenship is really in a different place, but here we are, we find ourselves in Babylon. Let me give you some backdrop so you can appreciate the text that we're about to study. Daniel chapter 3 begins this way in verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. An uncertain amount of time has elapsed since the events of chapter 2. How much we don't know for certain, but apparently enough for Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, to have forgotten what he had learned about God, about the God of Israel. And if the Septuagint would be the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. If the Septuagint is accurate, then the image described here was constructed around the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, approximately 16 years after his dream had been interpreted by Daniel. Most would target 586 BC, which, coincidentally, is also the same year that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and thereby presumably defeated and discredited the God of Israel. Well, such an impressive victory would have provided this polytheistic king an excellent opportunity to construct an image designed to help unify his empire and consolidate his authority. And although the image was more than likely in human form, it probably wasn't an exact replica of the king. Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer suggests that it was more than likely a statue representing Nebuchadnezzar's patron god, false god Nebo. Whatever or whoever it depicted, it had to be just an awesome sight. You'll notice it was located at Dura. Dura means walled place. And so evidently we're talking here about a flat plain enclosed by surrounding mountains. And the height of 90 feet, this thing stood 90 feet in the air, would have made it visible for a distance of some 12 to 15 miles. The language here, an image of gold, should not be misinterpreted as solid gold. The weight and cost of that kind of image would have been prohibitive, more than likely made of wood and then overlaid with gold plates. Check out verses 2 and 3. I want you to get the picture here. There's an event described. All the big wigs are present. This great mass of people have come together, no doubt dressed in their finest uniforms and attire. The orchestra was there in their multicolored costumes, perhaps seated on a raised, decorated stage. They're tuning their instruments. They're getting ready to play Hail to the Chief, right? And so this just tremendous assembly gathers before this image as it rose tall and overpowering, dazzling in the bright sunlight, and there, burning ominously in the background, was the fiery furnace. Just try to picture that scene, and it had to be an incredible sight. If you picked up an outline on the way in today, you can follow along with me. You can fill in some of those blanks. I'll fire off some other references your direction as well. But let's start with the predicament, okay? We'll pick it up at verse 4. And the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace." The king's motive here in building this image appears to be political as opposed to religious. Given the fact that he's conquered so much territory, and since most of it was in the hands of native princes who represented him in provinces that were far from the capital, Nebuchadnezzar wants to unite his kingdom. He wants to unite these provinces and assert his authority over his kingdom. And for that reason, he's insisting that all his officials, that all the populace bow to this image that he had constructed. Well, sure enough, just as was described in that section, we get to verse 7, and the band starts to play. Every person who was part of this massive throng drops to their knees. All except 3 courageous Hebrews that we were introduced to back in Daniel chapter 1. They refused to bow. So you might imagine they stood out rather significantly, right? You see, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it was revolting to think of bowing to any idol, no matter who issued the edict. They recognized the king's edict was in violation of the first 2 commandments. They, remember, had grown up in godly homes where parents had instilled those kind of values into them, and so they were familiar with God's law. They were familiar that this edict from Nebuchadnezzar would go in violation of the first 2 commandments. And so in resisting, they establish a positive role model for us as followers of Christ. Yes, we're obligated to obey the laws of the land. Christians should be the very best citizens of any nation. We're obligated to obey the laws of the land until those laws come into conflict with God's laws. And at that point, God's law becomes the higher standard, doesn't it? So I wonder, are you able to relate at all to these men? Here are 3 guys who had been brought up with a strong faith in God who find themselves, they had been transported from the homeland, from Jerusalem, to a foreign kingdom, to a pagan kingdom in Babylon, a completely alien culture. The reason being, now they've been physically moved, right? We haven't moved physically in this country, but there's been a shift, hasn't there? In recent years, and with an increasing acceleration, there's been a dramatic shift from a culture that has been broadly monotheistic to a culture that is increasingly relativistic, atheistic, and antagonistic of any expressions of faith in God in public. To the point now where we actually have our own government institutions harassing, infiltrating churches, coming against pro-life individuals. And I'm guessing that most of us sense this shift. I'm thinking most of us know and can discern what's happening. A recent Lifeway survey revealed that the majority of Americans, 54%, believe that religious liberty is on the decline in our nation. In fact, nearly 6 in 10, 59%, say religious tolerance for Christians in the U.S. is on the decline. And notice there that viewpoint is held by 41% of people who aren't affiliated with any faith. So it's not all believers that are weighing in on this thing. It's true. We're not facing the exact challenges of these three Hebrew young men, but clearly the resistance is intensifying, isn't it? So we've considered the predicament. Let's look, secondly, at the protest. We'll pick it up at verse 8. At this time, some astrologers, or some ancient manuscripts actually translate that as stool pigeons. At this time, some stool pigeons came forward, and they denounced the Jews. And they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king. But there are some Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you've set up." If you like to mark up your Bibles, you might underline that word denounced. It indicates that the accusation against these Jews was made maliciously. And we can surmise that it must have galled these envious Chaldeans that they had been bypassed. And instead, these important government positions have been given to these foreigners. Like many smear campaigns, this one employed insinuation and played on prejudice. And you can see the word Jews there, right? These Jews. It highlights the fact that these three men are foreigners. They're not part of us. They don't belong here. Chaldeans are clearly implying that these men would be more disloyal than native-born officials, an implication for which there was no evidence. And then you see that phrase, "who pay no attention to you, king." It carries with it the suggestion that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were showing gross ingratitude to the one who had put them in office. But these insinuations totally ignored the conduct, character, and clear record of these three men. It was these guys, along with Daniel, who had been responsible for actually saving the Chaldeans' life, right? Chapter 2 last week, Daniel had revealed and interpreted the king's dream, which actually spared these men their lives. But that didn't matter, because after hearing the report, look at it, verse 13, furious with rage. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar calls him in on the carpet. He orders these men to be brought into his presence. And as he spoke with them, a little bit of a mood change. You see it there in verse 14. It's almost like the king is stunned. See how he begins? He says, is it true? Right? He's incredulous. Is it true? He apparently found it difficult to believe that anyone, for any reason, would refuse to obey his commands. But then in a more conciliatory tone, he opts to give them another chance. It's almost like, okay, let me go over this. Maybe you didn't get it the first time. Let me just kind of go over this and we'll review what the rules are here, right? Verse 15. When you hear the music, you need to fall down. You need to demonstrate that allegiance, worship. But if you don't, you're going to be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Now look at that last line. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Can we just pause here long enough to consider how easy it would have been for these guys to cave in? And let's just stop and think about that. How easily they could have reasoned, hey, one time's not going to hurt. Right? God will understand. We'll just bow this one time, and then we'll immediately ask for forgiveness. And God's a God of grace. I'm sure he'll cut us some slack. I mean, if we bow, our lives will be spared, and we'll continue to occupy our strategic positions in government and thus be able to help our people when they need it. And what about our ancestors? They set up idols all over the homeland. It can't be all wrong if everybody's doing it. You see my point? They could have easily crumbled under the pressure. But they understood that a higher principle was at stake. And in doing so, they provide us with an incredible example of what it means to take a stand for our faith and for our convictions. Christianity has never been a culturally correct religion. You knew that, right? Just a couple months ago, if you want to go back into the archives, we studied Jesus' words in John 15. Remember, if you were with us on that Sunday? Jesus said, if they hated me, guess what? You're probably not going to get a favorable response either, right? Essentially. Clearly, our faith will never be in sync with what's going on in our world, which means we should expect pushback when we take a stand for truth. But I love it because verses 16 and 17 in Daniel 3 have to be one of the greatest declarations of courage that you'll find anywhere in the entire Bible. Look what they say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king." A paraphrase makes their thought clear. If our God can find it possible to deliver us in terms of what he sees best, then we want you to know, Nebuchadnezzar, that he will deliver us. I like Leon Wood's comments here. Bible commentator Leon Wood says, the overall story makes clear the fullness of their faith in God's power. The courage displayed in this statement should not be missed. Nebuchadnezzar has just declared that no God could deliver them out of his hands, and now they're replying stoutly that their God could do so. They were ready to risk all in their earnestness to give a proper witness to God. This same desire to give a proper witness had no doubt been a major factor in their earlier refusal to bow before the image. To bow would have been to destroy the value of all their prior statements to others regarding the supremacy of their God. Now, look right here. Knowing that actions speak louder than words, they had remained standing without wavering. And the words that now follow may be even more commendable, if that's possible. You see it in verse 18. Our God is able to deliver us, King Nebuchadnezzar, but even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Two matters of significance here. First of all, these young men recognize that God's will might be different from what they would find pleasant. You see it in their admission there? They understood that God's will might be different from what they would find pleasant, and they're willing to accept it as such without complaining and without bitterness. Not only that, but secondly, these men didn't make their obedience to God contingent upon God's doing what was pleasant to them. It wasn't a matter, okay, God, if you come through for us, then we'll be obedient, then we'll live in honor. No, regardless, we're going to honor God either way, right? They're ready to obey God whether God chose to deliver them from the furnace or not. Can you see how timely this stuff is for us today? Because the pressure is intensifying. Will we follow the example of these three young men? There are other more current examples of this kind of thing. I'm thinking of a guy named Micah Clark. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. He's the executive director of American Family Association here in Indiana. On Wednesday, March 22nd, so just a few weeks ago, he testified in support of House Bill 1608, a bill that actually protects our Indiana children, kindergarten through third grade, from instruction on human sexuality. The 4-hour session was dominated by leftists, LGBT activists, liberal ministers. Only 2 individuals were supportive of the bill, and Micah Clark was one of them. stood up for the innocence of our children and the safety of our children. And as he left the Senate chambers, he was confronted by close to 100 LGBT activists who started yelling, screaming, and chanting expletives. Another example would be Riley Gaines. You familiar with Riley Gaines, NCAA champion swimmer? 2 weeks ago, she was on the campus of San Francisco State University, giving a speech, standing up for women's sports. She was physically assaulted, barricaded in a room for 3 hours after speaking on that campus, just for taking a stand for women's sports and against trans athletes in women's sports. If you want to see the dramatic footage of her attack, it's online, just Riley Gaines, physical assault, and Google that. You can see it for yourself. I'm not blowing this out of proportion. Individuals who refused to stoop when it came time to stand, right? So we've noted the predicament. We've seen the protests on the part of these men. And so here comes the punishment, right? Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. So at this point, Nebuchadnezzar just flies off the rails, and he loses all touch with reality. He went to absurd lengths to guarantee the execution of these men. This fiery furnace was more than likely a beehive-shaped kiln, remains of which, by the way, can still be found in this area of the world near the ancient site of Babylon. And these furnaces were usually fed from the top, but one could look into them through an opening in the side. 7 times hotter shouldn't be understood as an exact measurement, rather as an extreme superlative. The number 7, signifies completeness, right? It means more fuel was placed in the kiln than ever before to make this thing as hot as possible. And we know it was hot, right? We know it was hot, extremely hot, just from the fact that when the executioners carried these men and threw them in, it was the last thing they did in this world. And so what happens? Nebuchadnezzar settles back in his lazy boy recliner with a bowl of popcorn. He's at a safe distance from the furnace, and yet close enough to derive cruel satisfaction from the execution of these men that had just defied his decree. But Nebuchadnezzar was not prepared to see what he saw, because rather than 3 men bound in fire writhing in pain, he saw 4 men walking around as cool as cucumbers. Isn't that interesting? The king had attempted to use one of the most destructive elements of nature, but it wouldn't obey him. Apparently, the fire was subject to the will of one who was mightier than this king. And so you can see it there in verse 24 and 25. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into that fire?" They replied, "Oh, certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar's statement here concerning that 4th man in the flames is significant because he's speaking from the viewpoint of one who's been steeped in Babylonian superstition, as he recognizes the presence of some kind of supernatural being. The phrase there is literally a son of the gods, and it expresses the thought of a son of deity or the idea of a divine being. Now, it's doubtful that the king actually had insight to understand that he was in the presence of the very Son of God, and yet many Bible scholars admit that this 4th personage was either an angel or more likely was the second person of the Trinity, the second person of the Godhead. So what we have here is really Jesus in pre-incarnate form. Before he was born on this earth, Jesus showing up on location. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, God could have provided the deliverance without the messenger, right? He could have brought them through without this 4th person. But instead, he tangibly demonstrates his presence with them in their trial. The Lord had permitted these men to be cast into the horrifying furnace, but in doing so, he literally went into it with them. It's just a great reminder to us today that God promises that in every situation, we're not alone. We're never alone. There's been many occasions over the years where I've had the opportunity, whether at the bedside in the hospital or maybe at the hospice center or maybe just in another situation, but many times that I've been able to share the promise of Isaiah 43. And it's a great promise. But now this is what the Lord says: He who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel, don't fear, for I've redeemed you. I've summoned you by name, and you are mine. And when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. What a beautiful passage. Write it down so you can find it when you need it. It was clear to all that a great miracle had taken place that day. And so in verses 26 and 27, Nebuchadnezzar approaches the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouts, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. That is amazing. Years ago, I could not come home from Monday Night Bowling League without reeking of smoke. You know what I'm saying? And these guys are strolling through a furnace without their hair being singed. The only thing consumed by the flames was the ropes that had bound them. And in the face of that kind of evidence, the king was constrained to acknowledge their God was greater than the gods of Babylon. Look at it with me, verse 28 and following. Nebuchadnezzar says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angels and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, they defied the king's command, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to be cut in pieces. Their houses are going to be turned to piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Another aha moment for Nebuchadnezzar, right? I love it. Anybody says anything against their God, and we cut in a piece. Probably not your best evangelistic method, okay? I don't know. But it worked in this particular situation, right? Where is the courage in today's church that will follow the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Being salt and light in this day means standing up for truth. It means standing up for moral standards whenever they're under assault. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that too often we cave in to popular pressure and societal pressures. And just this whole idea, and you're hearing it more and more. Let's just get along, right? Be nice. Play nice in the sandbox. Keep your head down, and you'll be safe. That strategy is not going to work any longer. It's no longer viable in our day. Which brings us to the principles. What are our takeaways from this ancient account? Well, first of all, we learn that God's hand is on the thermostat, whether our faith results in triumph or tragedy. The experience of these three faithful Hebrews teaches us that there is no risk when it comes to trusting God. They didn't know how God would deliver them, but they knew one way or another he would, right? Either in this life or in the life to come. Had God allowed his servants to die in the furnace, they would have still been victors. They still would have experienced deliverance from the king. True, maybe not in the eyes of the Babylonians, but we must realize that the Lord will not always vindicate our faith in the eyes of the unbelieving world. What we do know is he will always do what's best. And so promises like Romans 8:28, familiar promises, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, those who've been called according to his purpose. In all things, God works for the best for those who love him and want to please him. Second takeaway, suffering is often necessary and can accomplish God's purposes in our lives. The furnace of suffering has a way of testing the genuineness of our relationship with God. Is our faith genuine? Do we love him for who he is? Or simply for what he does for us? 1 Peter 1:6-7 says, "In this you greatly rejoice, and now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that your faith of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ returns." We sang about that, didn't we, this morning, the refiner's fire. Somebody said, what life does to us depends a great deal on what life finds in us. And when we have faith in God and depend on his grace, we can actually rejoice even in times of suffering, even when we hurt. Finally, God has promised that in every situation, he will be present with us. I've already mentioned that today, but I want to come back to it because it bears repeating. We don't face these kinds of challenges alone. God will always be with us in our time of trial. Here's a great text. Hebrews 13:5-6. "Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, 'Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.' So we say with confidence, 'The Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me?'" I feel a candy bar challenge coming on right there. Joshua 1:9 was a little easier. Here's two verses, Hebrews 13:5-6. Whoever can quote that for me next Sunday, get a free candy bar. How about that, okay? Hebrews 13:5-6, our new candy bar challenge. The title of my message this morning came from H.B. Charles Jr. He actually wrote the foreword to the book that I've referred to a few times already in this series, Erwin Lutzer's book, No Reason to Hide. And after Charles describes what's going on in the world around us and our disintegrating culture, look what he writes in that foreword. He says, "As troublesome as these realities may be, the idolatries of the cultural moment are not the most significant crisis we face." He says, "We often act and react as if the climate of the culture is the most critical factor of the day. It is not." He said, "The world is the world. The world's going to operate. The world's going to function just like we expect the world to. And it's the height of absurdity to expect non-Christians to think and act like Christians. The world gladly bows before the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up." Now wait for it. Wait for it. What's he say next? "The problem is that the church is stooping at standing time." It's not what's happening in our world. It's not what's happening in our culture. That's the culture acting the way godly culture acts. We shouldn't expect otherwise. The problem is when the church caves in. The problem is when the church goes along with it. That's the issue. That's what we're up against. The problem is that the church is stooping at standing time. And then he concludes, "If the Lord tarries his coming and spares us to live, every Christian will face the moment of truth when the rulers of the false value system of this world will begin to play their music." You can't hide. You can't play nice in the sandbox, keep your head down, and think it's not going to come to your world. Ask the CVS employees. The time will come when every Christian will face a moment of truth when the rulers of the false value system of this world will begin to play their music. By God's grace, strength, and wisdom, do not bow to worldly philosophies that are false gospels. Be a hero. Be a hero who does not stoop at standing time. That would be my prayer for myself. That would be my prayer for this fellowship of believers. That we decide now, in advance, before the music starts, right? Before the music starts, that we would adamantly already have decided, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to clap. You can't make me clap. We're going to have opportunity to express that in song as we wrap up today. And we'll get on our feet as the guys lead us here.